And of course, the goal isn't whether we end up believing any spiritual statement or not, right? I think of as belief as sort of the enemy of spirituality. It gets in the way, right? It's the open-ended question that's the great aid to spirituality. It's a question that's married to a deeply contemplative perceiving of your experience, and also to a kind of devotion. And what I mean by devotion, it's probably the hardest thing to convey because it would sound abstract in the way I'm going to say it, but it's not actually that way experienced. But in a devotion, well, in the world today, I think we can make it more understandable. In the world we have today, right, where it's sort of like, it's just ideology ran rampant, right? On like almost all sides, right? Everybody's convinced they're right, and we all rushed to Twitter to make sure that our current belief system, more often it's not even a belief system, it's a judgment of somebody else's, gets great audience. So it's so we have all these means of projecting our mind state out into the world, right? And I understand there's part of that that's really great. Like it's great to be able to talk to whoever, your mother or father who maybe live in, Kazakhstan, and, and you can just text them something and say hello, and there's some really beautiful things about the technology, but there's also this other side where we can all project our mind state into the world. And mostly it's not even our mind state, it's our conflicted mind state. I do think the necessity seems to me glaringly obvious that perhaps to have a sort of devotion, something more than mere interest, something that's akin to something that's devotional, maybe even in the sense of something like a love of truth. Even if the truth starts out with, I don't know what's the truth. That's where any inquiry is going to lead us. Like that's where it has to go. It has to clear the deck, right? All spiritual inquiry, the first thing it has to do is clear the deck. You've probably all heard of the old image of the Zen master pouring a cup of tea to somebody, some new student, and just keeps overfilling the cup. And the person's like, don't you see that it's full? And of course, the old Zen master is like, yes. And just like that, unless you empty your mind, nothing new can enter it. And it makes kind of a nice, quaint Zen story and all that. And then we hear it that way, and we kind of like, oh, that's for them. It's for the poor person on the other side of the Zen master, But I know a lot of you that, when you do any kind of deep looking within for the truth about you or God or the world or whatever, it's at first we're looking for the truth, we're looking for the thing, we're looking for the right answer. But then it starts to, the beautifully corrosive part of the process begins, where the question itself starts to sort of dissolve all of our own assumptions, right? That's the clearing of the deck. That's starting to empty out that cup a little bit. And because we can't just slam what we think of as truth right on top, like putting a cherry on the top of a banana split, all of our illusion. It doesn't really work that way, because even if we find it, it'll just sort of dilute the truth that we just slapped on top of it all. It's like it has to be, we have to see through everything. And that can be a combination of both challenging revelatory, hilarious, and whatever other descriptive word you want to call, right? As we start to see through, until we start to realize through our own investigations, not because someone told us, but because we started to look, we start to realize that, gosh, outside of practical knowledge, right? How to get to 7-Eleven. Of course, none of you go to 7-Eleven because you're very spiritual, but but outside of practical knowledge, that we start to realize that we really don't know anything. That's like one of those first markers, right? Where you see, okay, how serious is somebody? If we're not yet willing to see that we really don't know anything, like that's where we're going to stop. We're going to stall out. Not much can happen then. Not much can happen. But that sounds negative, doesn't it? Like, who wants to see that they don't know anything? But it's actually not as negative as it sounds. Like, there you are. You ever had this happen? You're in a discussion with, say, a friend or a lover. And sometimes you see things a little differently, so it just starts to get the heat starts to come in, right? You can feel it. The rising of the inner psychological temperature comes in, and you start, it's still cultured, but it's starting to heat up, and right sometime in the middle of that, have you ever had it happen where all of a sudden you're arguing for a point and it just strikes you like, I don't even know if I'm right. You ever had that happen? Right? And it kind of like, and there's a decision point, right? Do I keep going as if I do? Right? That's what I've been trained, right? Don't appear weak, don't appear stupid. Or do you go, gosh, and if you've ever done this, you know what? I'm not really sure. And that moment where if you've ever done it where you've said, I'm not really sure, immediate intimacy comes into the experience, right? There's some different energy, right? All of a sudden, it's like something gets a little closer. The defenses are a little more relaxed. You and the person you're with feel a little more connected, right? I'm not really sure. And you can, of course, just leave it at that, I don't know, or that becomes a basis for an actual exploration. Like, that's inquiry. And when I say there's a devotional aspect to it, in other ways than I'm mentioning, but in this sense, there's a devotional aspect to it, and like, we have to value that kind of coming together more than we value winning. That doesn't mean you'll always come together, because, right, sometimes you'll realize you disagree. It's like, okay, cool. You see life differently from me. Well, congratulations for us. Who would want to live in the world where everybody saw everything exactly the same? Can't tell you how many times I've had people come up and say, so Adьya, wouldn't it be great if the whole world woke up tomorrow? Like, it'd solve all of our problems. Don't get me wrong, I'm more than willing to have to find out what that would be like. But the fact that like every human problem would just sort of mystically disappear in the fire because we'd all just look at each other and go, yep, I see it exactly like that. That's not what happens. What we might do is something more like, oh, you see it like that. Oh, that's an interesting way to see it. I see it like this. And then maybe you have a kind of dance together. Maybe you have an actual dialogue, right? Dialogues where neither person wants to win are fun. There's something inherently exciting about them when you want the truth more than you want to win. or be right. And I don't know about you, but what I've found, and only thousands of times, when there's two people that join in that, even in the most practical kind of dialogue, solving the most practical kind of thing, that when the truth, and I'm not talking about truth in some absolute sense, but something a little lower level, lower hanging fruit, let's say. But when the deepest truth for that moment anyway shows up, if both people were and are in a state where they valued that truth, wherever it happens to be, more than they valued anything else, that when it shows up, both people always recognize it. Always. Every time. It's kind of like, oh. It's an amazing potential that we human beings have. And doesn't mean that that's going to be the truth forevermore. Maybe a week later, you know how things change, but only constantly. And then the next week might need just a little bit different version of it, of that truth. And that can be, oh, look at that. You know, this whole stuff in spirituality about egolessness comes in really handy. It has a real, even though it's sort of a deep sort of realization thing, it comes in really handy as practical boots on the ground, living life thing, you know, when you're not like firmly planted all the time. And yet, the paradox is, and yet, you have you also, I know this sounds completely contradictory to everything I've said, but you also retain the ability to have conviction in the way you see something. That's important to, even though it's contradictory, to allow that in too, because you ever notice the most, even historically, the most enlightened people, they're not pushovers. They're not like, well, you know, okay. Right? They're pretty, they have a backbone. And so one could hear what I'm saying is, sort of that it's never appropriate to sort of stand your ground. Right? Jesus stood his ground. Buddha stood his ground. Martin Luther King stood his ground. You know, so it's not that there's no time for standing your ground. It's just that before we stand our ground, we better be damn sure of the ground we're standing on.